contributing to moving from asking for the truth finding to institutional reform to address the violations. The microphone is yours. Thank you, uh, dear moderator, for this important webinar and for inviting me over. This is such a meeting, an important one that gives way for conversation and discussion in a healthy manner to our brothers and sisters in Yemen in order to maybe compare the transitional justice model for the success of this important goal and journey. I would love to salute you for your start. It's a very healthy practice for the transitional justice mechanism to expose to the other models, and especially the Moroccan, which is a North African model that is important in terms of the context. So Morocco, as the different international experiences in the transitional justice, have witnessed grave violations to human rights, especially after independence. So Morocco was ranked 43 in the 60s. These were called the years of lead or lead and fire, during which there were different forms of torture and illegal practices that were rampant at that time, different events that Morocco has experienced at that time. Maybe one of the key experiences, there were major and minor events, but though there were some events that stood out and they were connected regarding the power struggle and power rotation, especially that we're speaking about a monarchy. So the power rotation and things like that. So one of the key events was how to establish the state, especially the colonizers and the independence, and we were under the colonization. However, the way to move from one phase to another, one stage to another. So this was characterized by the struggle between the different political actors on the ruling at different contexts. Therefore, there were no associations in that sense, but maybe some movements, some groups, especially that at that time, the conflict at that time between East and West was prevailing, and also the left wing was in the political space. So this conflict was characterized by different alternatives, like everyone was picturing the state in a different way, which led to a struggle. And of the most important events was that of 1956 and then 65 and 81, as well as 84 and then 90, but especially two failed military coups. So such events generally are similar with other experiences in different countries regarding transitional justice. So the approaches in the social movements, usually you have the authorities practicing violence and arbitrary arrest and torture, and so they are similar with the different experiences, but they differ, of course, from one country to another. You can't compare the violations in Guatemala against the indigenous people to the Amazighi, for example. So there are different tiers or different levels of violations. However, those violations, how to connect the violations with the movement and the growth of the human rights movements in Morocco, especially late 80s. Before the 80s, there was a coordination, there was a committee for the victims, especially mothers. Mothers of the abductees, they were struggling for their sons in the prison, similar to that in Argentina. So the mothers had a main role in the journey of human rights and liberties in Morocco. And the late 80s, important human rights movements appeared, most notably the Moroccan Center for Human Rights, and among others, demanding the release of detainees and to improve the human rights at large. Besides that, there were other human rights movements in the diaspora. So there was coordination between those for a different Morocco, a contemporary Morocco that respects human rights. So within this mobilization, there was another tendency to safeguard the human rights and to defend the detainees and others. I think my colleague was a witness on such mobilization. So such development had an important ramification. Therefore, even the undercover organization wanted to topple the monarchy. So that was also, those organizations were connected with the surrounding, with the transitions, with the coups that took place. So when you read the context, it has to be done within the state as well as internationally. So the mobilization also around affected the human rights movement inside the country. Therefore, Morocco, before the establishment of transitional justice, which is up until 1996, so before that, the track started to shift in the 90s. After the fall down of Berlin Wall, there was a radical shift in the political system in Morocco. So by establishing the Human Rights Center, releasing the political detainees, uh, constitutional change in 1996, establishing the Ministry of Human Rights, establishing a rotational government to include those who used to oppose the government. Therefore, the 90s played a key role, especially that His Majesty the King Al-Hassan II played a role with the international engagement at that time. The 1999, Mr. Abdelhaq was one of the founders of the ERC. So the discussion has started about how to address the grave violations to human rights. So within this rotational government, all the way to 2000, 1999, they reinstated the staff who were detained and violated. They were instated to their job with the settlement of their status after launching an important initiative. After the discussion, there was a human rights discussion on the right to liberties to the victims. The forum included victims and the chair of the forum at that time would lead the ERC in 2003. He himself was a political detainee. And then we had His Majesty the King. There was a recommendation for the Advisory Council for Human Rights in order to deliver reparation to the victims of the allow me to interrupt you. We'll come to the reparation. I'm not going to elaborate on the reparation. I just want to indicate an institution. The reparation is going to be something different with Mr. Abdelhaq. Okay, just to keep track with time to cover all the questions as much as possible, how the human rights movements and the Victims Association played a role. So let's see what Mr. Abdelhaq have to say. Dr. Mustafa provided the political context as well as the human rights context, but any track of this kind is not only formed by the political environment. There should be social actor and collective and association actors and human rights defenders who kept pushing toward the recognition of the victims. So if you can elaborate on the movement of the human rights mobility, mobilization, and the victims, and practically how was this formed and what enabled the civil society to push toward this. And also, since we have Dr. Mustafa mentioning the abductees' mother's role in Morocco, we have a similar experience now in Yemen. So if you can also mention to us how women, whether as victims or human rights defenders, were involved at this point. So, Mr. Abdelhaq, please go ahead. If you can unmute yourself, please. Arwa, if you can unmute Mr. Abdelhaq, please.
عبد الحق حاول تستعمل
هل في إمكاني الحل هذه الإشكالية؟
Is there a way to solve this problem?
هل جربت ضغط على المايك؟
ممكن تضغطوا على المايك أستاذ عبد الحق؟
جربوا اضغطوا على المايك، صورة المايك.
بيرسلوا له الدعوة بس. أروى إذا ممكن تحل المشكلة.
ممتاز.
تفضل أستاذ عبد الحق، نسمعك الآن.
Mr. Abdelhaq, please, floor is yours.
هل تسمعوا؟
المايك مفتوح الآن، أعتقد لو تكلم حنسمع.
تفضل أستاذ عبد الحق. هل أعيد السؤال؟
So the question again?
اسمعني أستاذ عبد الحق.
عنده مشكلة تقنية.
So looks like there's a problem here. So let me move to the following question until this is solved.
أستاذتي ليندا أنتي ميوتد.
يعني نحل المشكلة، تنحل المشكلة عندي. طيب الآن تسمعنا أستاذ عبد الحق، ممكن ترد على السؤال؟
So Mr. Abdelhaq, can you hear me or shall I move to the following question?
ممكن تكلموا نسمع يعني إذا في صوت. ممكن إن أنتوا تخرجوا وترجعوا الاجتماع، في مشكلة.
So maybe if you can disconnect and then reconnect. Mr. Abdelhaq, if you can just log out and then try to reconnect. Okay, until we have Mr. Abdelhaq again, let me move to Ms. Hooria. We were supposed to have Mr. Abdelhaq first, but based on what Dr. Mustapha has shared and very swiftly about the role of the civil society organization and the human rights activities, how can we benefit from experience or what is being done now in Yemen, how to have a role by the civil society organization and the victims and women to preserve the transitional justice cases within the public space despite the complexities of the political scene? And if you can keep your camera on, please. So in the beginning, I'd love to thank you. I'd love to thank the Peace Track Initiative for this webinar and for the topic itself. I'd love to thank our guests from Morocco. I'd love to thank everyone indeed, everyone joining the webinar, because the transitional justice topic, it was in 2011, it was a problematic topic. It was not responded to. Actually, to the contrary, there were pressures against that because, as you know, the violators, they don't want the fact to come out. They don't want to commit to not repeating the violations. And if there was an actor or two actors before the unity, I mean, before the 90s, but now you have multiple actors, a proliferation of actors. You have like a group of armed militias here and there in the country, and each one of the conflicting parties have their militias, and everyone is acting extra legally, totally away from the law, the constitution, and the state. And of course, sadly enough, the dictatorship in a country, the authoritarian ruling regime, they should have their efforts and services to keep the people safe, to secure the people. But the authoritarian state are actually totally against that. They oppress people. So it's a problem. Therefore, I would say that we need to continue discussing that. We need to continue searching deep into that, and also to benefit from the experiences of the others. Dr. Al-Mustapha shared their experience regarding that transitional justice, because also when I was in the Human Rights Ministry, in the Ministry of Legal Affairs, Dr. Muhammad Al-Makhlafi was the chair of the ministerial committee assigned to draft the law. So we were strongly slammed by international actors. They said that the draft law here is not responsive to the international standards. And that was true because there was, immunity, so you don't need to seek the truth, no accountability, no need for apologies. And as you know, in our society, which is tribal, so we're not accustomed to apologizing. It's there in different forms, but in fact, the reconciliation government have practiced that. They apologized to the South regarding the violations that took place in the South before and after the unity, excluding the Southern people, and also apologized for what happened in Sada and the 6 wars that were ignited until 2010 or 2009. The clashes between the security forces and the rebels at that time in Sada. So it's extremely difficult to deliver transitional justice with the same international standards. As a Minister of Human Rights, I was a hardliner regarding the international standards, but now that I'm listening to some experiences, I believe that contexts are different. You need to address them differently, and especially now we need to take into account the development that took place since 2011 so far. We need to take into account that and to benefit from other experiences, Arab, African, Latin American experiences. So the core of the transitional justice remains the same, and we need to hold tight to it. The fact-finding is an important component because nearly 2 weeks ago, I met a girl whose father had been forcibly disappeared since 1987. She says, we just want to know his whereabouts. Maybe he has died already, but we need to know. We need to know. The reparations are important. Reparation is not necessarily monetary or physical, but it can be a moral one because they defamed those people. So maybe they need to be redeemed. If they have any job entitlement, then it needs to be reinstated. So it's physical and moral reparation and the preservation of their history and their memory as part of the national memory. The crimes need not to be abolished, and this goes also for women. We want women. Women are victims. Victims are directly victimized. They have been abducted, extorted, sexually assaulted, so on and so forth. But in the meanwhile, also women are victims of victims, I mean, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, as a sister. family
اعتقاله، تم
member
إخفاؤه،
who's
بس
been
هي
arrested
يعني
or
هي بهذا
forcibly
الشكل أو
disappeared.
ذاك هي ضحية. لكن أنا فقط لا أريد
So
أن
one way
أركز
or
على
another,
حالة
women
دور
are
النساء. النساء
victims, but I'm
بدون
focusing on
فاعل.
the role, the
يعني هنا
active
أتكلم
role
عن
of women.
الاشتراك
I'm speaking
وعن
about the peace track here
العفو وعن خارطة السلام الذي
and
عملناها
the
معا
peace
في
map that
الاشتراك.
we
يعني
drew
تكلمنا عن
together
موضوع
in the
القضايا
peace track,
القتالية. لم نترك هذا الموضوع.
in the
نحن
peace
نتكلم
track
عن حقوق
initiative.
الضحايا.
We're speaking about the
نحن
rights of victims.
طبعا لما نجي نتكلم عن العدالة
Well,
التقليدية،
if you
عن
want to
العدالة
discuss the
الجنائية، هذه في
conventional and the
الأوضاع
criminal
العادية.
justice, it
لكن نحن
happens
نتكلم
in the
عن
normal
حقوق
situation,
ضحايا
but we're
كثر
speaking about
سقطوا في
the rights of many, many victims
يعني سقطوا قتلى أو ما
who
زالوا
were
محصورين
either killed
حصريا
or are
أو
missing
تعرضوا للتهميش
or have
للإقصاء
been
إلى آخره.
excluded.
فالمرأة يعني
So
مفروض
women
أنها لا ننظر لها فقط كضحية، ولكن
should not
كفاعلة
only
في
be
كل
perceived
آليات
as a victim,
العدالة
but also as an actor
الانتقالية. يعني
along
مثلا
all
في
the
برامج
stages
كشف
of
الحقيقة،
transitional justice, for
في
example, in the
برامج
fact-finding
جبر الضرر
programs,
والتعويض، في
in
الإصلاح
the
المؤسسي،
reparation and
في يعني
redress
في
programs, in the
مؤسسة
institutional
القضاء، في
reform,
مؤسسات
in the
الأمن، في
judiciary, in
مؤسسات
the
الجيش،
security, in the army,
التعليم، في الإعلام إلى آخره.
education, media.
أنا
So,
تعذروني أنا أقاطعكم بس
well,
لا
excuse me for
عادي
having to
عادي، أضبط
interrupt
الوقت.
you.
أنا معك أضبط
No,
الوقت.
that's fine.
لكن
It's good to
هذه
keep track of time.
الجزئية
But
بالضبط
this
اللي
part
بتذكروها هو السؤال
that
اللي
you
حابة
are
إني أنتقل
mentioning
فيه
takes me to my
للأستاذ
next
عبد الحق
question
إذا هو
to Mr.
سامعنا،
Abdelhaq if
إذا هو
he
ممكن
can hear
يتابعنا
us,
الآن، لأننا حريصة جدا من
because
خلال اللقاء اليوم
I'm
إنه
keen
نتكلم بشكل عملي
during
أكثر
today's
حول
webinar to be more
كيف
practical
شكلت
about
الحركة الحقوقية أو
how the
بالأصح
human rights
الجمعية
movement
جمعية
or the
الضحايا
associations
كيف
or the
عملت
victims
منذ
of
إنشائها
associations have been
كمحركات
established and
في
documented the
السنوات
violations to
ما
preserve the
شارك فيها
memory in the
الضحاة،
years, the
وأيضا
so-called
دور النساء
years of blood,
كيف كان دور
and also the
النساء
role
سواء
of
كضحايا أو
women, whether
كمدافعات عن
as
حقوق
victims or human
عن
rights
حقوق الإنسان.
defenders.
أستاذ عبد الحق هل
Mr.
تسمعني الآن؟
Abdelhaq, can you hear me now?
أستاذ عبد الحق.
فقط لقد تواصلت معه أن هناك مشكل، يمكن من عندكم أن تحاولوا من جديد لأنه دخل وخرج.
So Mr.
الآن أنا
Abdelhaq
شايفة أن المايك مفتوح
has
بس مش
logged
عارفة.
out and reconnected. He's unmuted, yet we cannot
ما في
hear
مشكلة.
him.
ممكن ننتقل
Okay, so let's
يعني ممكن ننتقل للدكتور عادل
move
إذا
to
أمكن.
Dr. Adel.
طبعا التحديات
Dr. Adel,
في اليمن
the
اليوم
challenges
كبيرة
in
جدا.
Yemen are plenty in
إمكانية
Yemen at
أنكم
present.
تمثل عناصر مثل كشف
The
الحقيقة
potential to
والاعتراف
have
بالضحايا وإعادة بناء الثقة
fact-finding
والدولة
and
بالمجتمع
recognition of victims and to
الدولة
reestablish trust
الدولة
between
المجتمع ممكن تكون مدخل
people and the state.
مهم لأي
This
نقاش
can be an
مستقبلي
important
حول موارد
introduction to any
البحث
future dialogue
الانحكاكات
on
والمنطقة.
addressing
لكن هل
the
بدون
violation
مساءلة
heritage. But
أو هل
without,
التجربة
I mean,
المغربية ممكن
the
تطبيقها
Moroccan
هنا؟
experience,
إيش
do you
ممكن تكون
think it's
إشكالية تطبيق
applicable to
التجربة في
Yemen?
اليمن؟
What can be the problems of applying such
شكرا
experience to Yemen?
جزيلا
Thank you so much.
والشكر موصول
I'd love
للحضور
to
جميعا
thank all the
والضيوف
participants
الكرام.
and the esteemed
أنا
guests.
في تصوري الشخصي
I personally
أن
believe
التجربة
that
المغربية
the
تنتمي
Moroccan
إلى الجيل
experience
الثاني من
belongs to the
العدالة
second
الانتقالية،
generation of the
وإن كانت
transitional
قد
justice,
اعتمدت على مبدأ
even though it
يعني
depended on
خصوصية
the
أو كونية
principle
المبدأ
of,
وخصوصية المنهج
you
الداخلي.
know, the principle
وهذه التجربة إن
applies and
صح
then the
التعبير هي
approaches might be
اعتمدت
more
على
specific.
المصالحة
It depended on
السياسية
the
بين
political
النظام
reconciliation
وبين
between the regime
المعارضة.
and
فلا
opposition.
محاكمات ولا
So no
إدانات،
trials,
وتم
no convictions.
الاكتفاء
However,
بتدابير التحقيقات
only
المستقلة
the independent
وإعادة الحقوق
investigation mechanism
وكذلك الترضيات المعنوية
and
والتعويضات
also to
لأسر
reinstate the
الضحايا.
rights and
لكن
physical
لم
compensation
يسمى
in
الجناة
reparation to the
تجاوز
victim's family, but the
الأعباء
perpetrators
الانتقالية
have never
كما
been
في
mentioned
التجربة
in names
المغربية،
in the
بل
transitional
حتى في
justice
تجارب
as
أخرى
per the Moroccan
دولية
experiences and other
مثل في
international
الجيل
experiences,
الأول على سبيل
like the first
المثال كما في
generation, for
الأرجنتين
example,
لم
as in
يتم
Argentina.
تطبيقها إلا فيما بعد
This
المساءلة وما شابه
was
ذلك.
applied, I mean, the
ولهذا
accountability
يمكن أن
later on.
نقول أن
Therefore,
التجربة
one can say
المغربية
that the
نجحت
Moroccan
نجاحا
experience has
باهرا في
succeeded
إنجاز
tremendously
مصالحة
in
أو
finding
مصالحة سياسية
political
ارتكزت على
reconciliation
محورين
pinning
أساسيين.
on two main
أول هو
pillars.
جبر
First
الضرر
is
المادي
the
والمعنوي الذي
physical and
ارتكب
moral
الضحايا
reparation
وتعويضهم
to the
ماديا
harm
ومعنويا
inflicted on the
وإقامة
victims
ما يشبه
and to
يعني
compensate
إن
them
صح
and to
التعبير
have,
بعض
if I may call it, some public spaces for as memorials. But Arab-wise, the Moroccan experience is one of the pioneering experiences, as well as in North Africa. At least it depends on the political reconciliation, as was the case in South Africa, when the recognition took place, but there was like a pardon, recognition for the pardon, the amnesty, rather than to have any trial for the perpetrators of human rights violation. In the Yemeni context, it's entirely different. In Morocco, there was opposition and monarchy. So the reconciliation took place between both. And there was like a compromise through the Equity and Reconciliation Commission, and it continued working. Still, I think it still works to the moment. Therefore, it succeeded at least in the materialistic and moral reparation to victims. In Yemen, we could have started likewise, and we have discussed that in the outcome of the national dialogue outcome. And we have rules and regulations on the reparation and investigation, and we had a negotiative justice similar to that took place in Yemen, i.e. between the regime and opposition. And the former regime was granted the diplomatic immunity in turn of not having any trials for the regime members, so to have political settlement and reparation, and the Sada people received an apology, and the southern people as well. And the other issues have been discussed, included in the remote areas like Tahama and Marib, and there was an agreement on the draft of the National Dialogue Outcome and Transitional Justice. The situation following 2015 and following the Houthi coup have entirely shifted. So the victims became like the weeper and vice versa, or the whipper and vice versa. So things have interacted. So the state institutions have collapsed. If you want to uncover the truth, it's going to be difficult. Additionally, there are regional factors. You have regional interferences as well as international. You have violations by the international interferences, whether by the US or the Arab coalition against the innocent people in Yemen. So you have an entire regional and international system and extra legal groups violating the human rights in Yemen. So if you are discussing the transitional justice from the first generation, the classical concept, then it will face many challenges, including that you can't discuss transitional justice in Yemen per se in that form, like fact finding and then reparation and then trials and institutional reform. However, if the transitional justice is combined as part of the reconstruction system in Yemen, then we can start with the recompensation or redress as an introduction to have the remaining pillars of the transitional justice. And by the way, this experience took place in Argentina. In the beginning, there was no accountability. It took place only in 2005. This is where there was the strict transitional justice law implementation and holding the human rights violators accountable, those who violated before 1983. So if we start with that in Yemen, at least to hold tight to the victims' rights, to the materialistic and operation as an introduction, either to get into a political settlements or negotiative justice, or also other human rights confrontation. Therefore, I would conclude saying that I can say that the civil society organizations in Yemen can continue with their documentation and to uncover the violations so as to use those documentations in the future if the reparation is not going to be initiated. Thank you so much, Dr. Adel. I'll get back to you, Dr. Adel, as well as to Dr. Mustapha, but before that, let's try to see if Dr. Abdelhaq finally. So finally, we can hear you. So let me get back to the question because it comes at the core of today's webinar. Most of the participants here work in the civil society organizations, and they want to understand better how you performed in the documentation of violations as associations, especially women, whether as victims or defenders. And also, if you can introduce to us the practical steps, since you are one of the founders of this commission. Thank you. I'd love to welcome the friends and the participants, the audience, and I'm sorry for the glitch I had. As for the role of the civil society organization in the facilitation of transitional justice in Morocco, I was able to listen to Dr. Al-Mustapha's comments. So precisely, yes, the families movements had a major role in this regard. The families have formed their movement in the end of 60s, especially in the 70s, with the leftist detention in Morocco. The families' mobilization was formed of mothers and sisters and wives of those detained. Generally, it was formed of women. So their presence was extremely strong, and this movement has started and played an important role even in the creation of the human rights associations in Morocco. As was said in the previous intervention, what distinguishes the Moroccan experience is that the mechanism to just turn the page over have started in the early 90s in Morocco. The establishment of the Advisory Council for Human Rights, which is a national institution, it was for this purpose. So, to abolish all the impact of the past violations. And then this track continued by the release of those missing and the political detainees in 1994, all the way until the end of 1999, when a commission was formed for the reparation of victims. However, the victims' associations have contributed and have been interactive with this commission that had the responsibility only for reparation, but they also demanded more. They demanded to expand the authority of this commission, which led to the establishment of the Equity and Reconciliation Commission and the Victims Association and the victims' families movements. They played a key role in the finalizing of the fact document, which was the document for the negotiation with the state in order to create this commission. So the role of the families, the role of the victims association, it was such a prominent role in expanding those joining this document, including political parties and the different actors. However, the distinguishing features of those organizations was that it was inclusive to all the victims from the 60s to the 90s. In 56, there were some political conflicts between the different political actors, political conflicts that sometimes would amount to assassinations, political assassinations. But though we were able to combine all those contestants within this association, which has included all the victims, including also in the 70s and 80s, the Marxists and the Islamists. So the different parts of the spectrum were represented in this platform, and also together they were able to join this document. Even more, they safeguarded this document and they mobilized the support of the rest of the political parties to get the approval of the Moroccan state on the document, which would be discussed in the Advisory Council of Human Rights, that is a state institution, and the discussion would evolve later on until 2004, where this mechanism has been established. Thank you, Mr. Abdelhaq. Okay, we're still discussing the Moroccan experience. There's a key aspect of the Moroccan experience that's worthwhile because it went beyond the individual violations to the dealing with the effects of exclusion that affected entire societies and communities. My question, Dr. Al-Mustapha, the ERC, besides the individual reparation, dependent on the collective reparation, the so-known territorial development, to support development and social projects in certain areas that have been marginalized or have been affected by the violations during the so-called years of lead. To what extent did this help to redress and to enhance the citizenship? And more frankly, did it achieve the desired outcome? Thank you. Thank you for asking this question. The question is nearly horizontal with the other experiences of transitional justice, which is the collective reparation or the so-called territorial development. This is the areas where you have undercover detention facilities or arbitrary facilities. They were encircled, blockaded 100%. It goes back to, as if to the medieval era. People would just vanish into thin air. So it's an area that never witnessed any development. But as part of the reparation programs, now we have 149 projects, direct projects, by the ERC and the National Council for Human Rights after getting the support of the EU and the other partners. Therefore, those territories, those regions, for example, Tazmarmat or other areas, to have more civilization of those areas that have been strongly impacted, to have facilities, public facilities, so for example, schools, health facilities, mosques, to pave the roads. So they were totally away from the center and from the civilization. So there were programs as part of the ERC or the Human Development Framework to have those areas that have been violated, where you have individuals who were innocent, they were not relevant to any politics, they were not against the state, but they were wronged anyway. Therefore, the Moroccan experience tried to merge them and to have this collective reparation. But though, because the projects were timelined, it was not like 1 year or 2 year project. Therefore, the violations that took place was a result of socioeconomic rights. So in those marginalized areas, maybe there were certain projects to get them to a different state. Therefore, after the ERC established in Morocco, the National Initiative for Human Development was created for to start projects in different territories in Morocco. So until today, 20 years now, this when this initiative had been created. In addition to this initiative, there were other projects in different ministerial sectors and the territorial development. They tried to connect the remote areas with the civilized areas through roads and railways and the health facilities and educational facilities. Therefore, despite this effort, 20 years now, after that, however, there are still other regions in need of these projects, and it's a human nature that we don't, we don't have the job done until we die, so the projects are still ongoing. So, and humans will keep demanding different things, but generally speaking, the collective reparation, despite the disadvantages for some areas, however, it was an essential introduction for the state to regain trust between the people and the state. So that was a main point. And it tried to highlight the reconciliation within the ERC framework for those remote areas that had been isolated. So it took it to a positive aspect. At least there is trust between the state and people and between the different people. Thank you, Dr. Mustafa. Sir Abdelhaq, very swiftly, please, how do you look at the outcome of this approach? And if you can elaborate more on the individual reparations, to what extent did they succeed in connecting the transitional justice, the impact of justice, and the exclusion and marginalization? Regarding the collective reparation, let me add to what the doctor has already mentioned, that it has been founded on the expansion of the concept of the victim. So the ERC did not consider a victim the one who had been arrested or had been tortured or had been killed, but the concept has been widened out to include the collective victims, meaning the regions or areas that has suffered from having a secret detention facility within the area, because this led to the marginalization of the entire area. And this area would be like encircled. So we considered that the residents of such areas are also victims. They are victims in that sense. Also, the areas that was collectively punished, for example, in the events of 1973, there were certain areas that have been punished collectively because many residents have contributed in armed operations, and therefore they have all been punished. The entire region have been punished. So the ERC here, well, of course, you cannot compensate the residents of such areas at the same level and same criteria that you would deliver reparation to individuals or victims connecting with political organizations. However, here we have selected this approach of reparation, that such regions had been marginalized, and so now we need to give them their rights of development and to lift their isolation and encirclement. The programs, because of the limited resources, it wasn't possible to meet all the needs of those areas. However, we focus in the first place on the creation of smaller projects, especially for women. For women in those areas, so it takes us back to the gender approach also in the ERC, which was a cross-cutting thing in the different programs of the ERC, in the collective reparation programs, as well as in the compensations or reparation that was delivered to the victims. As for the compensations, it was launched with this arbitration commission, so it could deliver compensation to over 7,000 victims, the majority of whom are victims of being forcibly displaced, disappeared, and arbitrary detention. The ERC continued the same efforts, however, with a different approach. So, for example, the arbitration commission would compensate the victims with the same amount of money for male and female. However, It added for women. So the ERC considered that women have suffered impact that men did not suffer and kind of violations that men did not suffer. So, for example, rape and GBV, denial from motherhood. As for women, also denial from the hygiene during detention. That was a major problem for women, to the point that one of the women in the public hearing, she focused on this problem. For her, it was extremely embarrassing, more than torture, for example. So this concept have been included as part of the compensation criteria. As I would say that between the first arbitration panel and the ERC, we have compensated over 27,000 beneficiaries. Financial compensations. There were different forms of reparation, like administrative settling, and I think that Dr. Mustapha will speak about that, and social inclusion, whether for women and men who are victims, and 9,000 victims have benefited from health insurance, health coverage, because as you know, the violations leave their impact on the body and the psychology of the victims. So everyone who did not benefit from any health coverage, as for the staff and others, they have benefited from this free of charge medical care by the state. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sure there's a lot to say regarding the redress and reparation, how most of the group will have, the bare minimum of it. But to make the best use of time, let me move to Dr. Adel. So let me ask this. In Yemen, we have the wrongdoings are not only connected with the violations inflicted on individuals, but we have cities and areas and group of people who are being excluded and marginalized over long decades, which led to the attrition and their trust of the country. And they have an attenuated citizenship sense. If we speak about the collective reparation regarding the state and the safety of Yemen, what are the challenges of taking a similar approach in Yemen in light of the continued conflict and political division? And also, is this experience applicable in the first place in Yemen? The question goes to you, Dr. Adel. If you can, please come again with the question. So my question is about collective reparation. After Dr. Mustapha's and Dr. Abdelhaq's interventions. So my question is, do you believe that in Yemen, since there are wrongdoings, not only connected with the violations against individuals, but also certain areas and certain groups feel being excluded and marginalized? So is this approach of the collective reparation applicable in Yemen in terms of establishing the state and the peace in Yemen? And in the future, I mean, there are many reasons. Maybe you can list if possible. Yes, it's highly possible to have collective reparation and individual reparation as well. First of all, when we speak about the collective reparation, for example, in Eastern Timor, when it was under the Andalus ruling, and then following 99, after the independence of Eastern Timor, the collective reparation has been initiated, and Indonesia also took part of the responsibility. Today, we have different regional international actors. So when we're speaking about collective and individual reparation, then I think that you can lobby and apply pressure on those actors to start with this kind of reparation. Also, we have the culture of the moral reparation. We have social and cultural and traditional and tribal heritage that we can take advantage of in order to facilitate the collective reparation morally, if I may. Therefore, if we want to start with reparation, then we need to acknowledge that we need the state institutions. The state institutions are not even there. But the good thing is that we have the foundation, we have a system, applicable system, if there's a inclusive political settlement to be achieved. So we can activate the transitional justice law and the national dialogue outcome regarding the reparation, and the mechanism is detailed on how to administer the reparation individually and collectively. So the transitional justice law, the draft of it has detailed this, referencing the international law regarding the compensation and reparation, and actually suggested the creation of a local fund, a Yemeni fund for the reparation and compensation, and to be open for the regional international assistance and even local ones unconditionally. But we have challenges at present. The challenges include that you don't have state institutions, and the sub-state groups are controlling the country, and the interfering powers in Yemen do not want to discuss anything regarding the transitional justice. They consider this something that's trivial and insignificant, at least should not be included in any fair peace and political resolution. Therefore, all the international agreements and international mediation efforts would fail because they would focus on having any penetration in the political resolution, even at the expense of the victims, and to move the transitional justice to be discussed later on. So that's part of the failure of international mediation in different countries, not only in Yemen. The other thing is the political powers in Yemen. They would prefer not to discuss the transitional justice now and not to be included as part of any future political resolution. And actually, it should be delayed to after peace and political resolution between the different conflicting parties. Additionally, the regional powers, they don't want to discuss the concept of the transitional justice at all. So you have regional challenges, local challenges, as well as international challenges. You have an active civil society that's documenting most of the cases. They have their files. So I believe that it's possible to have a political approach to be phased and to include all the regional and international and local changes regarding this crisis, and to have medium and long-term strategy by the civil society on how to address people's cases. So we can start to discuss with the international community and the countries involved in the Yemeni conflict. Like, there's no trial at present, no discussion of that. Actually, we can start with the financial and moral reparation of the victims, and also the reparation can be part of any political resolution in order not to lay off the victims' rights. And there should be a political resolution that takes into account the best interest of the victims and the violators of human rights. So to have a win-win solution that satisfies everyone, the victims, and not to upset them, not to upset the others, because they have the power to thwart any political resolution. If we have an approach with the region and with the conflicting parties in the country, to start with a remedy, with a reparation, then I think that it's going to be a breakthrough in the transitional justice and can be applied by the second generation concept as it was applied in Morocco. Thank you, Dr. Adel. Yeah, of course, such regional and international approach should be followed because of at least of the limited resources. Let me move to Ms. Hooria. Before heading to you, Mr. Abdelhaq, you mentioned the smaller projects for women and the gender approach, especially that women suffer the most and have suffered the most in Morocco. How can such approach and project contribute in regaining trust and equal citizenship in Yemen, if it is to happen? First of all, very quickly, let me add to what Dr. Adel Dashela mentioned. In fact, the international society that has worked on the second generation as human rights defenders and the victims' families who were some victims who have been arrested, some have been freed or not. In the second track, we have strongly worked referencing the outcome of the national dialogue regarding the different parties, regarding the government. The first track, there's some glimpse of hope. The glimpse of hope have been manifested in Riyadh discussions 2022, the reconciliation commission that resulted from this. It included a transitional justice group, and it gives us indicators. And the rapporteur of this group is a woman, so it shows commitment by the legit government. Also, by the international community and the envoy's office, we used to suffer. They wouldn't pay much attention to that. They wouldn't take it as seriously as it should be. From 2020 and 21, during the Greyfield, there was the joint declaration without the transitional justice. I think the peace track analyzed the joint declaration, which was the conclusion of the meeting between the two parties, the legit government and the militias, the de facto authority. However, it never mentioned the transitional justice. As advisory group in the envoy's office, we pushed to that. And then afterwards, from 2022 or 23, they started to have meetings with the grassroots, civil society organizations, different spectrum, and the transitional justice started to be there strongly. So the key thing here is to affirm that in any future peace agreement, that transitional justice should be included. As civil power, we need to make sure that it is there in order to advance in addressing the past heritage and to have institutional reform and to head to the future without holding grudges, because we have the culture of retaliation. If your rights are not given back to you by the state, if the transitional justice does not do that, then people are going to revenge, are going to retaliate. So we want to avoid this. We want to avoid such practices, which is going to have harmful impact. So let's get to women and the small projects for women. This is something that's excellent because we know that women have been largely impacted by the war. And now I know that there are some initiatives targeting women and youth, some projects, small projects, some projects that would generate income. We're still not in a war, as it means we are in the no war, no peace phase, and we hope that we're going to get out of it to respect the wider horizon of peace, leading to de-escalation and then truce and then peace negotiations. So women are actors,
وبعض النساء
and
الحقيقة
some women
استطاعوا إنه تكون
were
عندهم
able
صمود ومرونة
to be resilient
ويعني وتتجاوز هذا الواقع
and to
الضارع. بالعكس
overcome
يعني بعض النساء
this
أنشأت
reality.
بعض
Actually, some women
المشاريع الصغيرة
have created
وشغلت
some
معاها نساء
enterprises and employed
أخريات.
even other women.
الآن في استراتيجية
So
شبكة
now,
التضامن النسوي
in
نحن
the
لدينا
Women's
مرتكز
Solidarity Network
ولدينا
strategy,
يعني
we have
محور مهم جدا في
an
التمكين
important
الاقتصادي.
pillar in the
التمكين
which is the
الاقتصادي
economic
نريد أن
empowerment.
نخاطب
Economic
الحكومة، نريد
empowerment.
أن
We want to
نخاطب
talk to
القطاع
the
الخاص
government and the
إنه ما
private
ننتظر
sector,
إلى فترة السلام، لا
not
من
wait
الآن
until
نحن
peace is
ينبغي أن
being
نستهدف
achieved. As of
النساء
now,
وتمكين النساء من خلال
we
البرامج
need
الصغيرة،
to
من خلال
empower
المشاريع
women through
الصغيرة،
small
تعويضهم
enterprises,
عن الأضرار التي حصلت عليهم حتى قبل ما يأتي مثلا مؤسسة العدالة الانتقالية
even
عبر
before the
القانون
institutionalization of
والهيئات
transitional
العدالة
justice
الانتقالية. لا،
through the law,
ينبغي أن
through
نمضي في هذا الطريق.
we need
أستاذة
to.
سبقتيني، هذا كان عنوان المقترح
Okay,
الثالث.
that was the title of
احنا
my third
انتقلنا
question,
تلقائيا
Miss Hooria.
للمحور الثاني،
I think we have
وطبعا كسبا
swiftly
الوقت يعني
transited
بيجري
to
سريعا.
the other
أحب أنتقل
theme
أول مرة
here.
أعطي الكلمة للأستاذ
So let
عبد
me
الحق،
give the
لكن
opportunity to
أيضا
Mr. Abdelhaq,
ممكن أضيف
but
سؤال
as
إذا
well,
سمحتم،
maybe I need
حول
to ask you a
إنه
question.
مر عقدين على إطلاق هيئة
2
الإنصاف والمساواه،
decades
وأنا
have
مهتمة
passed
بشكل
since the
شخصي وأعتقد
establishment of the
الحضور أيضا
ERC.
إنه بحكم عضويتكم في لجنة متابعة
I
توصيات الهيئة،
think
إحنا
that
عندنا
as a
كذلك
member of
لجان
the
المتابعة.
committee monitoring
فأنا أحب بشكل خاص
the
أفهم
implementation of
بحكم
recommendations of the
عضويتكم
Commission, so I'd
ما
love
هي
to
القضايا التي
understand
ما تزال
what
مطروحة
are the cases
للنقاش
that
اليوم،
are
وهل
still
وكيف
under
تقيموا
discussion, and how do you
أثر توصيات
assess the
من جانب
impact
الإصلاح
of the
المؤسسي
recommendations in
وضمان
terms
القانون
of the
والشرع.
institutional reforms and to guarantee the
إذا
no
سمحتي
repetition?
بعجالة
Just
شديدة
very
أود
quickly,
التفاعل مع ما
I would love
قاله
to interact
الدكتور
with
عادل
what Dr. Adel has said,
بخصوص
and
البناء.
the lady as well,
هذه
regarding
مسألة مهمة جدا بخصوص البناء على ما هو متفق
regarding
عليه.
to build
أعتقد
on
بأن
what has
هذه
been agreed
المسألة
on.
هي التي
This is
سهلت
important. I think that
انخراط جمعيات
it made
المجتمع
it easier
المدني
for the civil
والدولة
society
إلى جانب
organizations to
لإرساء
get engaged and
وإنشاء
to
هيئة
play the
إنصاف
role
والمصالحة.
in the creation of the
عقدنا
ERC.
مناظرة وطنية
There was a national
أجرتها مجموعة
debate
من الجمعيات الحقوقية
attended
والفاعلين
by
السياسيين،
the different
وكانت هناك مسألة
organizations and
خلافية،
political
مسألة
actors,
المساءلة
and
والمحاسبة أو
the
محاكمة
accountability was controversial
الجلادين.
and
ولكن
to hold the perpetrators
كانت هناك
accountable.
مرونة،
But there was
لابد أن نذكر ذلك،
flexibility.
وأنه
Yeah,
كانت هناك
I need to be
مرونة
fair. I
في
mentioned
التعامل
that
مع
there
هذه
was
المسائل
flexibility
الخلافية
addressing those
وسط مجموع الحاضرين،
debatable
وسط
issues
مجموع
among the
المشاركين في هذه
audiences.
المناظرة الوطنية، وبالتالي تم تأجيل
So
النقاش حول هذه
the
النقطة
discussion was
إلى
postponed. The discussion
وقت
on that was
لاحق،
postponed
ولكن تم
until
التركيز
later.
والاتفاق على
However, we
باقي
focused and
المسائل
agreed on the
التي
rest of
كان
the
متفق عليها.
issues
أقصد
that
بذلك
were agreed
موضوع
on,
الحقيقة، موضوع
i.e.,
ضمانات عدم
the fact
التكرار، موضوع
finding to
الذي يخشى
guarantee the
الصين
no
إليه تعويض
repetition,
وجبر أضرار
uh,
الضحايا.
the
إذا
victim
لا بد،
reparations.
أعتقد
So
أن
I believe that
الجمعيات والمجتمع
the associations and
اليمني أيضا
the
واعي لهذه
Yemeni
المسائل،
society,
وأعتقد
the
بأن
Yemeni people
التركيز
are
على ما
aware
هو
of that. And I
متفق
think
عليه
to focus on
يمكن
what
أن
has been
نبني
agreed
عليه
on
فيما بعد
as a
للوصول إلى
foundation to
المسائل
build on until we get
الخلافية.
to the debated
بالنسبة
issues.
للسؤال بخصوص
As for the
هل ممكن تذكير
question, whether,
السؤال؟
if you can remind me of the
حاول
question,
أنه
please.
بعد عقدين من على
2
إطلاق هيئة
decades
الإنصاف،
have
كيف
elapsed after the
تقيمون أثر
establishment of the
التوصيات
ERC. How
وما
do you
هي القضايا
recommend
التي ما
how do
تزال
you assess the
مطروحة
recommendations?
للمستمع؟
What are the cases that
على
are
كل
still
حال
discussed now?
المشاكل التي لا زالت
The
مطروحة
problems which are still
إلى
under
الآن مسألة
discussion
الحقيقة
is the
ومسألة
fact,
جبر
the truth,
ضرر
and also
الضحايا
the
الذين
victim
وقعوا بوفاة من
reparation.
خارج الجزائر. بالنسبة للحقيقة
As for
وجدنا
the
هناك
fact or the
صعوبات
truth,
في
there were
الوصول إلى
difficulties to get
عدد
to
من قبور الضحايا. وصلنا إلى أعداد
graves of
مهمة
some
ما
victims.
يزيد على
We
400
could uncover
حالة
over
التي وصلنا
400
وحددنا أماكن دفنها،
cases,
ووصلنا
their
إلى
burial
تحديد
sites,
هويات القبور عن
and
طريق
we
الADN، عن
identified the
طريق
bodies
الحمض النووي.
through the DNA tests.
ولكن في قبور
However,
لم
there are
نتمكن
graves
وليست
or
لدينا
burial
أرشيفات
sites
للوصول
where
إلى
we don't
أماكن
have,
دفنها،
uh,
وهذه
we
مسألة
can't
لا
really
زالت العائلة
locate.
تطالب
So
بها وهذا
the
حقها
families
طبعا.
still have demands
ولكن
regarding this,
حللنا
and
هذا
I totally
المشكل
understand that.
بأنه كل عائلة
We solved this,
لم
that each family
تتوصل إلى
that
تحديد مكان
could not
دفنها
identify the
تتمتع
location of their
بتوصية في
beloved ones,
مقررها
they
التحكيمي
have a recommendation in their
تلتزم فيه الهيئة
arbitration
وتلزم
report
الدولة
that
بإبلاغ
holds the ERC and the state bound of the place of the burial site whenever it is found out. This is a demand that the families are still insisting on, of course, and the human rights organizations as well. Another thing, there are some victims who were not able to have their application for compensation within the legal time frame as set by the ERC. But I believe that this can be sorted out because the government even is committed and willing to compensate them, especially that they are not big in number compared with the number of victims who have been compensated. Also, the guarantees of no repetition, I'm not sure if I have the chance to discuss this now, or maybe there's a question regarding the no repetition guarantees. Just briefly, because we're running short of time. Okay, just briefly, I believe as for the no repetition guarantees, all the recommendations that His Majesty the King called the good recommendations or the wise recommendations, including the fair trial and incrimination of forced disappearance and torture, these have been incriminated as acts. So what we wait for now is the penalty, death penalty, and the Roma trial is still there. The civil society organization is still doing the job and still lobbying to activate that as a recommendation. Thank you so much, Mr. Abdelhaq. That's something that's important. I think that's one of the most important guarantees, even for the Yemeni context. So let me move to Dr. Al-Mustapha. You have mentioned that the ERC experience was important in the Arab region. Also in Morocco, it was part of a very specific political context. It was connected with the transitional phase itself. My question, just in brief, for all the speakers, what's the bare minimum of justice that cannot be compromised regardless of the complexity of the political situation? It needs to think it over. And I need to be cautious while answering this question. The bare minimum, first of all, we need to realize that we're moving from the conventional justice to the conventional justice, from the justice of the trial and different accountability mechanism to another thing regarding settlement, political and human rights settlement. So to have an agreement between the different political parties, but not to get away. If you apply the usual standards at the time, it's not going to be successful. There's no model that have applied it and made it. So we need to pay attention to that. And there are specificities for each region. So Yemen is not Morocco, for example. Morocco is not Yemen. So for Yemen to follow such mechanism with the specificities of Yemen, maybe it can custom made this model to be a better experience. So for example, so the social structure in Yemen is different than that of Morocco. We need to pay attention to this fact, especially that when we're speaking about the instability and the elections and political participation, and another project which is the religious ideology. So I think the bare minimum is that we need to define the priorities, to try to conclude peace agreement to ensure peace between the different political contestants and the fact-finding and reparation of the victims as per the priorities and institutional reform, that's number 3, and legal reform, and to engage in the international mechanism for human rights. And last thing is, I think, memory preservation. Because as the gentleman said, the generation of accountability, you should have the legal framework, because the majority of transitional justice so far have later on issued amnesty laws, Argentina, Peru, Chile. Then we need to pay attention to that, because we're speaking about transitional justice, not the conventional justice by the courts and trials, especially that during the transition, the judiciary body is usually fragile, and sometimes the court wouldn't even have an archive. So we need to pay attention to that for the political resolution and for the transition and to construct the state. So the Yemeni should be busy with the establishment of the Yemeni state now with this political context. Thank you, Dr. Mustapha. I know it was a tricky question. I had to ask it because this question touches one of the most important issues in Yemen now, which is the relationship between peace and justice, whether we need to wait for the peace or a resolution, or to start with some tracks to pave way for peace and justice. Ms. Hooria said that we should not wait a political resolution. We should start working. I'd love also to ask Dr. Adel, if we look at the Moroccan experience now, what are the main learned lessons for Yemen to learn from, and also what are the things that should not be replicated because of the different contexts, as Dr. Mustapha has mentioned? One of the key learned lessons is that the approach taken by Morocco for reparation, as I've mentioned early on, it was a local approach. So as per a clear political agreement between the state and the international agreement or the opposition, but a local agreement on clear steps to take. So those steps depended on the reparation principle and to postpone the sensitive issues. In the final report of the Equity and Reconciliation Commission, they redacted the names. They were never shown to public, and so it was a report for the king to express opinion on. So the fact was found, but without exposing names, and the reparation was done, and the country took care of it, and there was more than 80,000 files. However, as my colleague mentioned a while ago, they addressed some files, like tens of thousands. I don't know how many exactly, approximately 30,000 or 28,000. So in Yemen, in fact, we have started with this, locally speaking. This is called the daily justice, if I may, meaning to practice peace through the local mechanisms or media. We have started with this through the local initiatives, local mediation efforts, community initiatives, the civil society organizations' efforts. We have started with this, addressing the victims' cases before reaching to a political resolution binding to the countries and the conflicting parties. Another thing, as Al-Mustapha mentioned, my colleague mentioned, even in countries like South Africa or Chile, accountability took place, and arrest of dozens of people took place also. They are in prison so far, but they did not want to plead guilty for release, so they stayed in prison so far. It's a special prison for the criminals and killers in Chile. However, in South Africa, they pleaded guilty, so they got an amnesty. So in Yemen, we know the perpetrators. We all know the perpetrators and the victim, but we are unable to get this perpetrator to court. So the implementation of transitional justice again from the first generation is unlikely in Yemen and even in any Arab context. But then in the second generation, so we have a study between the collective reparation, reparation in Morocco or Yemen. We can benefit from the different steps. Morocco has a legal framework that regulates the reparation and compensation. And in Yemen, we have a draft to organize this and is ready, and you can start with it. So I think that this is the maximum we can benefit from the Moroccan experience, to find a local mechanism that fits with our context and to start with the easiest thing that would not anger the different conflicting parties in Yemen and even in the region. If we can start with, especially that we have a social heritage and we have already draft, so we can have the victims' cases as part of any political resolution. So to start with the reparation as an introduction for the political and social reconciliation, because no reconciliation, no national reconciliation without reparation and redress. And reparation cannot happen without political reconciliation. So when we're speaking about political reconciliation and national reconciliation, we need to connect them with the reparation. So if we want to have national reconciliation, no trial so far, so we need to connect this with the reparation and redress, be it financial or moral or in whatever form. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adel. So no political reparation, no political reconciliation without reparation, and vice versa. So let's move to Ms. Hooria very quickly, please, if you can comment on Dr. Adel. What need to characterize the transitional justice track in Yemen? And you mentioned to benefit from the national dialogue outcome and transitional justice draft. So we still have 3 minutes only, but I noticed that most of the participants are just commenting on the session, no questions really, so I'm going to give them more room. So, first of all, you mentioned in your question whether to postpone the reparation until the transitional justice is being institutionalized or have laws. No, because there are interventions that need to take place promptly. For example, those who have been affected by the mines, the Houthis in the first place as perpetrators, they planted mines everywhere to prevent the legit government from advancing. In rural areas, in areas where you have children and women going to fetch water and the woodwork, so the mine victims, these are conflict victims. And the state here is committed not to wait for the transitional justice. This cannot be delayed. They need prosthetic limbs. They need a psychological support. They need dignified life, because these are not productive yet. They can't work. They can't farm. So the country needs to have a role now. And also, we mentioned the apologies that took place, the reparation funds that were announced in 2013 and 2014, the confiscation of the lands in the south, and the state seizing the private properties,
المسرحين قسرا من وظائفهم
and
العسكريين
those who have been
والمدنيين
dismissed
في كان لهم
from their jobs.
وتم أيضا ضخ أموال للتعويضات
And also, there was some money for the reparation, but then after the war, those committees have been suspended. So there are interventions that need to take place as of now. But, you know, the quantum transition with the transitional justice needs to take place, first of all, to embody in the peace agreement, and also to take place through transitional justice mechanisms during the peace era. That's something that is essential. Another question, the part I did not respond to, what was it about?
كان سؤالي بشكل عام.
My question in general was the learned lessons from the Moroccan experience, and you mentioned our experience with the transitional justice in the national dialogue, and to constitutionalize it. So all the outcome of national dialogue, that was something that was hectically debated, but there was a team, concentrated team on the transitional justice and all issues with national dimension. So they are incorporated in the new constitution draft, but all the outcome did not go in vain. They were the result of the dialogue between different political and social spectrum. 30%. There was 30 or 20% representation of women and youth. All the marginalized groups have been involved. So the outcome, when we opt to peace agreement, we will get back to reference those and to take into account the developments that have ensued. You have the outcome of Riyadh consultations in 2019 in Riyadh, between the Transitional Council and the legislative government, and then Riyadh consultations have been expanded. So these are things that we're going to reference, as Dr. Adel mentioned. And we have our practices. We have the tribe, we have the local mediators, we have the civil society. So we have things relevant with the transitional justice, with the peace building, calling for peace from this situation in Yemen. And thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hooria. Just having a quick look on the chat box, most of them are comments on what you have mentioned and the importance of reconciliation in Yemen. And also you wanted the Sudanese experience, but maybe we can have another webinar for that. It's worthwhile. So before the conclusion, let me ask a question for the four of you. If you can share the most important lesson of today in one recommendation, one learned lesson to deliver to the Yemeni for any transitional justice in Yemen, what's your recommendation? Let me start with Mr. Abdelhaq. Thank you. From the Moroccan experience, the main factor for the success of the Moroccan experience is the political will by the state. I think that without it, it wasn't possible for the Moroccan experience to succeed. But this political will have played, the civil society has played a key role in the facilitation of that the country got to this political will. Starting from the civil society organization, they agreed on things to unite them and things that can be agreed on. So
اليمنية، وأعتقد أن
according
هذا
to
كان
the
محور
Yemeni
تم
experience,
مناقشته سواء مع
and this was
تقدمت به
discussed,
الأستاذة حورية أو الدكتور
as Ms. Hooria
عادل.
mentioned and Dr.
لابد
Adel,
من
then
تضافر جميع الإرادات من
all the
أجل
wills need
الوصول
to
إلى ما
unite
هو
together
مشترك والبناء على ما هو مشترك
to
في
build
مرحلة
on what
الأولى.
we have in the first place.
شكرا. الكلمة لك دكتور عادل.
Dr. Adel, please.
في الحقيقة
In fact,
علينا أن ندرك
we need
أن
to
جبر الظلم
realize that
يشكل
the
إحدى الآليات
reparation is
المركزية
one of
لتحقيق
the
إنصاف
central
الضحايا
mechanism for
ومنع تكرار
the redress
الانتهاكات
for the
في
victims and
سياق
to
أي عدالة
guarantee the
مستقبلية
no
باليمن.
repetition within the
هذه
context
نقطة.
of any future
النقطة
justice in
الأخرى
Yemen. Another thing,
بالإمكان أن نستفيد من التجربة
we can benefit from the Moroccan experience. Morocco,
أدركت الدولة
the state of Morocco has acknowledged that without addressing the violations before 99 and independence, 56 and then 61, the monarchy, and then 99, that the regime cannot continue with the same strategy if they don't address the victims' cases. Therefore, the state adopted the PRC project and started to address the reparation as per a very specific strategy to preserve the regime as well as the people's and victims' rights. In Yemen, if we want to break through the current crisis, we need to realize that it's not possible to have a political reconciliation or national reconciliation in Yemen without addressing the society and political issues, because there's no central system that you can talk to now. You have the sub-state groups. They have their own interests and violations as well against the people, as the lady mentioned, including the Houthis and other factions. If we are able to get to a model that satisfies everyone, this model to address our issues as citizens and you as a politician, and to start from the reparation and to have this as the key to solve the issue in Yemen, that you cannot continue in politics and authority if you don't address my case. If we can get to this or to such approach, then later we can implement the programs and mechanisms that we have started in the National Dialogue Conference, step by step, as per what we have in the country. And thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adel. Dr. Mustapha.
أنا أريد فقط أن أؤكد أن ما يمكن أن نستفيد من التجربة المغربية
What we can benefit from the Moroccan experience in the transitional justice is how can Yemen move from me to us. So, to build the national unity. How can you have a national unity without focusing on the political and legal and institutional legitimacy?
حتى أننا الأنظمة اللي ممكن العمل على تقوية الأنظمة العرفية التي سوف تساهم.
We can strengthen even the customary systems that can contribute to the establishment of the state through this journey until we have the state of institutions. So even the community and the societal reconciliation would play an important role in Yemen in the forgiveness and the transition. So the only and the main goal here is how to create national unity, no division, no different ideologies, whether in religion or politics or otherwise. So today, Yemen is in need of a strong political will, because politicians are going to make it happen, because the reparation, especially that the law, the transitional justice law, is going to have to be passed by the parliament. And this law, the regulations on the reparations and a part of the public finance is going to be voted in the parliament. So if there's no political will, then maybe you can have the experience succeeding for 5 years but then failing forever. Look at the Tunisian experience, how it started, but then how it ended. So the political will, as Mr. Abdelhaq said, the political will is important. However, with the different parties and the role of the civil society in the construction and building, this is important because the political aspect, if the political factor is there, it's going to be the key to build the country and for the national unity and solidarity between the different parts. Thank you, Dr. Mustafa. Let's have it finishing at you, Dr. Hooria. In fact, the actors, the perpetrators also need to understand that transitional justice is not only for the victims, and the reparations and the redress and institutional reform and to reintegrate them, but it's also good for the perpetrators themselves. Because if the violations have been addressed through the transitional justice, then that's it. The file will be closed. However, if that's not the case through the transitional justice, then the doors will remain open. And those crimes will never be dropped. If it's not addressed by the transitional justice, it's going to be addressed by the criminal justice because it's the victim's rights. You can't force them. Not the state, not institutions can't force the victims to just dismiss it. Someone whose son has been killed, whose son has been missing, and the whereabouts are unknown, there's no statute of limitation. So they should be willing to take responsibility of what they did, just to close those files and to head to the future all assured, because peace without transitional justice is going to be a fragile peace. It's not going to sustain. Thank you. Of course. Mr. Abdelhaq, do you have a comment? Just very quickly, please. I know that there's 300 Yemeni students studying in our universities in Morocco, and I hope that they have been watching this webinar. However, let me suggest something. I've been meeting with those students to introduce the Moroccan experience, and I want to stress through this webinar that the door is always open to discuss the Moroccan experience, and not sure how we can communicate through email or WhatsApp. So we can do that in coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the ministerial representative for the Ministry of Human Rights to have webinars all along the year for those students. And thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Abdelhaq. Let me draw your attention that most of our audience are members in the Yemeni network for justice, and we have Dr. Adel profusely working with this regard, and maybe we can continue the webinars. And also we have Ms. Muna Dawa. She's active in the Syrian file, so we're going to try to have more of those. However, regarding this one, we're going to have a summary report in Arabic and English and share it with you. And we're going to try to include the key points discussed in this webinar and to try to share the report with the stakeholders of the transitional justice. And Mr. Al-Haq, maybe you can share it with the Yemeni students as well. And if you have outcome of your meetings with them, then you can share those with us. And finally, I'd love to thank our kind speakers for their analysis and insights that they shared with us. I have personally benefited from this webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Looks like the webinar was so clear that no questions were asked, but some comments. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with you and meet soon. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.